as everyone is well aware, Ahmad will be doing our last presentation for the history of the medical humanities component of this conference. So his presentation is entitled Historical Catalysts for the Growth of the Medical Humanities. Ahmad is our conference co-lead. He is also a first-year medical student at Western University. He completed his undergraduate degree in Psychology and Sociology at the University of Toronto and worked for a number of years as an instructor at a community college. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Ahmad to give our last presentation.
Okay, thank you, Manisha. And as I said, it's a great pleasure to be here today. So again, I'll focus my presentation on a series of historical moments that I feel were important in the evolution and growth of the medical humanities as a field. And the historical moments that I'll focus on are the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. Secondly, the de-institutionalization of the mentally ill in the 60s and 70s and the advent of scientific psychiatry with the publication of the DSM-3 in 1980. And finally, the AIDS epidemic of the 80s and literary responses to the impact of that virus. Okay, so I'll just provide a fairly brief overview of the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. So in 1932, the United States Public Health Service began an experiment to look at the natural course of untreated latent syphilis in Black males. I want to emphasize the word untreated. There was no intention of treating the participants in this experiment. So subjects, experiment subjects were recruited from an impoverished county in Alabama, and 400 syphilitic men were selected in addition to 200 controls who were uninfected. And initially, there was some resistance by these men to participate in the experiments. So the researchers lied to the men and said that they would be receiving treatment and free care if they participated in the experiment. So there was a mass deception that occurred. And in fact, throughout the experiment, ineffective administrations of treatment were given to these men to sort of maintain the illusion that treatment was being given. And then finally, there were active attempts to prevent the treatment of these men. And the United States Public Health Service made a number of attempts throughout the experiment's course to block the administration of therapy to the men who were participants in this experiment. And even when penicillin became available in the 1950s, the men did not receive that therapy. And the experiment was only halted in 1972, 40 years after its inception, because accounts of it began to appear in the national press. And there was widespread outcry over the inhumane treatments that these men had received. And this is just a picture here where one of the subjects in the experiment is receiving what he thinks is therapy. And it's clearly an ineffective therapy. And again, that was to maintain the illusion that therapy was being administered to these men. So what sort of provided the impetus for this experiment? And there was a constellation of, or confluence of racial ideologies at the time that really gave birth to an experiment like this. One of the most prominent ideologies at the time was social Darwinism. And social Darwinism situated Black males at the bottom rung of an evolutionary hierarchy as being somewhat primitive, barbaric, and this was used to rationalize their dehumanization. And so it also created a sense of fatalism in regards to their treatments or improving their welfare, because they were seen as inherently primitive and barbaric, and there was nothing that could be done to shake this evolutionary schema. Another component of the racial ideology at the time was ascribing a hypersexuality to Black men, where they were predisposed to increased incidence of lust and immorality, and they were more likely to contract diseases such as syphilis. And then, curiously enough, scientists and healthcare workers at the time thought that African Americans did not want to seek treatment for syphilis. So I think what I was saying was that there was a sort of a constellation of racial ideas and ideologies at the time, such as social Darwinism, such as ascribing a hypersexuality to Black men, that really gave rise to an experiment like this. And what it really spoke to was a deeply ingrained racism within the institution of medicine. And this is just the front page of the New York Times reporting on this experiment. And there were other mainstream media outlets that did the same, and that sort of led to finally the termination of the experiments. So what were sort of the consequences or the repercussions of this? So clearly, there was an erosion of trust. There was a decline in health-seeking behavior among African Americans, and that continues to reverberate to this day. And the medical institutions are still attempting to repair that broken trust. Secondly, there were increasingly humanistic critiques of medicine as something that had become morally impoverished. There was a sense that medicine had become blinded by technological hubris, and what it was really missing was that holistic and human-centered perspective, something that spoke to the fears, desires, hopes, meanings of patients. And it was felt that literature and the humanities could offer that to medicine. However, again, something that was really absent from these humanistic critiques was a lack of engagement with racism within medicine, with the fact that there was a deeply seated racialization to healthcare. And so there was, in many of these critiques, it was sort of permeated by white privilege. The critiques spoke from a social location that was unaffected by racism, a very privileged social location. And so what we find is, if we look at the first 15 years of one journal in the medical humanities, Literature and Medicine, and the first 30 years of the Journal of the Medical Humanities, only 1% of the articles discuss race critically, or engage with race as a concept. And even works, foundational works in the medical humanities, such as Stories of Sickness and Arthur Kleinman's The Illness Narratives, did not explore or critically engage with race and how it can shape the physician-patient relationship. Again, it really spoke from a social location that was unaffected by racism. So what role does the medical humanities have to play in countering medical racism? I've listed 2 points here. The first point is that literature can allow for an immersion into another consciousness, an immersion into how someone from perhaps a different background may navigate their illness experience. And this can perhaps cultivate an empathic capacity for someone that's maybe different than yourself. Secondly, narratives can highlight structural determinants of health, can illuminate how race can function as a social determinant of health, and how social, cultural, and economic structures can shape health along racial lines. And so one example of this is Audre Lorde's the Cancer Journals. So this was something that was published in 1980, and it really spoke about her experience with breast cancer, her breast cancer diagnosis, and subsequent mastectomy as a Black woman. And I've quoted a passage here where she says, "I ache to talk to women about the experience that I had just been through and what might be to come and how they were doing it and how they had done it. But I needed to talk with women who shared at least some of my major concerns and beliefs and visions, who shared at least some of my language." And this lady, she's referring to a healthcare worker, did not. So in this passage, you can sense for her sorrow. She uses the word ached. This sense that there's no one in her interactions with the healthcare system that share her language, that share her beliefs, and that share her visions. And there's a profound sense of alienation and estrangement as she navigates her illness experience. And then finally, she alludes to the concept of environmental racism. She says, "For me, my scars are an honorable reminder that I may be a casualty in the cosmic war against radiation, animal fat, air pollution. But the fight is still going on, and I'm still a part of it." So she didn't focus on her breast cancer diagnosis as simply an individual medical pathology, but she connected it to wider social, cultural, and economic structures. And again, she emphasized the idea of environmental racism and how something like radiation or air pollution can disproportionately affect racialized communities, leading to disparities in health outcomes. So she saw her breast cancer diagnosis as a consequence of this environmental racism. I had a discussion question for the audience, but in the interest of time, I'll just state the discussion question. It's going to be something for you to think about or sort of ruminate on, and we'll just continue forward with the presentation. And so the discussion question is, in the aftermath of the Tuskegee experiment, erosions of trust, racial disparities in healthcare, what was it? I would say race still plays an important role. Racism still plays a significant role in shaping medical practice and research. Can you think of some examples in how the medical humanities can help to counter this? So just a question to sort of think about. So the second historical moment that I'd like to speak about today is the de-institutionalization of the mentally ill. And in the 60s and 70s, there was a push to deinstitutionalize and socially integrate the mentally ill into society. And what this did is it brought to the fore questions of stigma, social control, and the limitations of the biomedical model of mental illness. So as the mentally ill were socially integrated, they faced public stigma. So these were negative stereotypes and prejudices and discrimination by sort of the wider public. Significantly enough, they also experience self-stigma. So that's when public stigma is internalized and directed towards yourself. And this can manifest as a feeling of intense shame, as a desire to hide, a profound sense of abasement. And so those who were mentally ill felt profoundly ashamed that they had these conditions. And that is an example of self-stigma. And then from sort of it had profound consequences for the health outcomes of these patients as well, because to avoid the stigmatizing label of being mentally ill, they would not want to seek out care and treatment. And that was termed label avoidance. So medicine at the time was resistant to exploring a phenomenological subjective experience like shame. It did not seem to fall within its rigidly rational and biomedical structure. And here was an opportunity for the humanities to provide narrative explorations of this subjective space. And here I've sort of provided firsthand testimony from two individuals who have a disorder. So Shane has schizoaffective disorder, where he says, the voices I heard reflected all the judgmental attitudes I had heard from my family and church about LGBT identities. I internalized that shame and sting, and my own self-loathing brain turned inward and began persecuting itself. And then Joelle with PTSD said, I was very afraid and disoriented, and I didn't feel as though I could tell anyone. An immediate sense that this experience was clandestine and something to be ashamed of was present. And so here we have two individuals that have been labeled with various psychiatric disorders, one with schizoaffective disorder and one with PTSD. And while these labels are important, while these categorizations are important, there's an entire lived experience of mental illness that is not captured by this label. And I feel like that's where the humanities can play a role in sort of illuminating that lived experience. And I think it's vital for medicine to be attuned to these subjective responses from the mentally ill and what it is like to experience mental illness, because again, it can dramatically impact their health outcomes. So another historical moment that I'd like to speak to you today about is the advent of scientific psychiatry with the publication of the DSM-3. And this really paved the way and provided, this was very revolutionary at the time because it moved psychiatry towards framing mental illness as something that was a brain disorder with neurochemical imbalances and that would benefit from psychopharmacological interventions. So it sort of inaugurated that shift in framing what mental illness really looked like. And so with the publication of the DSM-3, there was a sense that the DSM was not, in some cases, an objective document that sort of categorized human dysfunction in a way that was immune from values and biases. And it was found that there were significant gender biases and cultural biases in the construction of some of the diagnostic criteria found in the DSM. And so one example of this was the higher prevalence of something called dependent personality disorder in women. And dependent personality disorder is a psychiatric diagnosis that is characterized by the inability to do things as a result of low self-esteem, a pronounced fear of being able to take care of oneself, taking excessive measures to gain nurturance and support from others, and having a difficult time expressing disagreement due to anxieties about losing support and approval. And as I said, there is a greater prevalence of this disorder in women as compared to men. So is this an objective fact, or is it a reflection of the wider sort of patriarchal social context that we are in? So in a gender stratified society where women are in still many ways subordinated to men, women are treated less equitably, and they learn through socialization to enact behavior that is sometimes passive and subservient. And they're more likely to be in a state of economic dependence on men. And so what I feel the humanities can offer here is that it can illuminate how patriarchal norms and the wider social context can impact the mental health of women, predisposing them to something like dependent personality disorder. And it can help us move away from this disorder being seen as something inherently more predominant in women. It can allow us to be more attuned to the social context that can give rise to the increased prevalence of this disorder in women. And then there's also a cultural bias as well in the DSM, where some of the diagnostic criteria reflect how mental illness is manifested in an Anglo-European cultural context. So for example, there's an underdiagnosis of depression in Japan as compared to North America. And again, the humanities can offer or provide a narrative space for how mental health is expressed in a different cultural context outside of an Anglo-European one, and maybe act as a corrective to this cultural bias that's found in the DSM. So here's a second discussion question. Again, we'll sort of, I'll just sort of state this and you can maybe think about it, and then we can just move on in the interest of time. And so the question is, what role can the medical humanities play today in addressing and countering the stigmatization and shame that accompanies mental illness? And in the last part of the talk today, I want to look at the AIDS epidemic during the 80s, because it gave rise to a number of literary explorations of its impact. And I'll focus on 3 literary works today. So there was Larry Kramer's play, The Normal Heart, that premiered in 1985. Abraham Verghese's memoir, sort of in my country, a doctor's story of a town and its people in the age of AIDS. And finally, there's Tony Kushner's play, Angels in America, from 1991. And so increasingly, it was seen that AIDS is not simply a discussion or a question of viral origin or epidemiology, but questions of the patient experience and the human condition were also part of understanding the impact of AIDS. And so in The Normal Heart, that was a play again that premiered in 1985. It centers on the AIDS epidemic in New York City between 1981 and 1984. And it focuses particularly on the impact of the AIDS, of AIDS on the gay community in New York City. And it really shifted the national conversation around AIDS and provided the impetus for a lot of social activism, subsequent social activism. And throughout the play, there's a palpable sense of anger, anguish, fear, and frustration as these characters, as these members of the gay community, fight against oppressive systems of power who are seemingly indifferent to their plight and skeptical about the seriousness of the epidemic. And again, these are two images from the play. This is actually a list. The set list actually included a continually updated list of the dead. And so in a passage from the play, it says, we're all going to go crazy living this epidemic every minute, while the rest of the world out there, all around us, goes on as if nothing is happening, going on with their own lives, not knowing what it's like, what we're going through. We're living through war, but where they're living, it's peacetime, and we're all in the same country. And so there's this, in this passage, there's this sort of dichotomy that's established. These two lived experiences where one community, the gay community, is living through a war, and the rest of society is living in peacetime. And they're living in war because they're fighting against the homophobia at the time, the stigmatization, the prejudice and discrimination that they're facing, and the indifference from those that are in power. Specifically, politicians were indifferent to their plights. The medical establishment as well was also indifferent and apathetic. And so they're fighting this war. And what this image of war and peacetime really conveys, it really dramatizes what health inequity looks like, and how one group who is marginalized and stigmatized can feel, while the rest of society doesn't really have to deal with those systems of oppression. And the play really represents a call to arms, and which is why it gave rise to social activism and ways to redress these injustices. So in my second example, in my own country, A Doctor's Story of a Town and Its People in the Age of AIDS, this account really looked at the author's experience as a foreign medical graduate in Johnson City, Tennessee. And it did so much to humanize the AIDS experience because it painted very vivid, poignant portraits of community members that were suffering from the virus. And moreover, it was also a very introspective and confessional narrative where the author spoke unflinchingly about the toll that caregiving was taking on his own mental health and well-being. And he even describes himself as being a man on the moon, as somebody that felt very alienated and estranged from the wider medical establishment as he was engaged in this caregiving. And of course, this has contemporary relevance today because we're talking about physician health and well-being and the toll that caregiving can take on your mental health. But this memoir was one of the first accounts, confessional, introspective accounts of what that toll really looked like. And so he spends some time as well talking about the stigmatization that accompanies something like AIDS. And he says that I lost 2 of my patients to suicide at a time when the virus was doing very little harm to them. I always thought of it as, I've always thought of them as having been killed by a metaphor, by the burden of secrecy and shame associated with the disease. And so he thinks, he sort of frames AIDS as something beyond a biomedical phenomenon. The way society talks and thinks about AIDS, the metaphors that it uses to describe this illness, can increase the suffering, profoundly increase the suffering of patients. Because again, going back to that concept of self-stigma, they internalize those metaphors and that language that society is using. They internalize it and they feel that sense of shame and that sense of abasement. And it can lead to profound mental health distress. He speaks about his role as a caregiver. And this was really a passage that acted as a corrective to the technological hubris that existed in medicine. And he says, we were biased towards technological interventions in the form of drugs and needles. Words like soul, the spirit were considered dirty words. There was no or little payment for the non-technological kinds of medicine. Hand-holding, family visits, home visits had no billing codes. Bronchoscopies, colonoscopies, and pap smears did. And so here, the author is really emphasizing those non-technological components to medicine and how something like hand-holding can be so integral to the practice of medicine. And then finally, I'll conclude with Angels in America. It's a very complex play that premiered in 1993. But I'll sort of just speak briefly on two themes that I think are relevant to the discussion today. So again, it really shifted the national conversation around AIDS, and it explores the AIDS epidemic through the lens of two couples in dysfunctional, failing relationships. So Prior Walter, who has AIDS, and his partner Louis, who does not. And Harper and her closeted Mormon partner, Joe. And then it actually includes Roy Cohen, a real-life lawyer who led a closeted existence and also succumbed to AIDS in 1986. And so early on in the play, there's an emphasis on the toll that caregiving, the toll that illness can take on the caregivers, those around the patients. So Louis is unable to cope with his partner's diagnosis. He says that I can't incorporate sickness into my sense of how things are supposed to go. It's almost as if he can't fit that into his framework of meaning, of his understanding of the world. And how his partner's illness has really shattered the way he constructs meaning. And he simply can't deal with it, and he abandons his partner. And there's a lot of guilt and anxiety that accompanies that. And so the play explores that very important dimension of how illness can have a profoundly fracturing effect on those around the patient, the loved ones. And finally, there's a strong sense of denial that permeates the characters' responses to their illness. They deny their diagnosis, they deny their sexuality. And of course, that just is a testament to the compounded stigma of their sexuality and of having something like AIDS. And so the lawyer, Roy Cohen, who has AIDS in the play, insists to the doctor that AIDS is what homosexuals have. I have liver cancer. So there's this sense of label avoidance. Remember going back to that concept, that sense that I want to avoid the label of being a homosexual. I want to avoid the label of having AIDS. Because there's a profound sense of shame associated with that label. And again, these literary works and literary explorations illuminate these concepts that I think are very important to the practice of medicine. And so these are just two images from the play. And then finally, last discussion question or something to think about. Can you provide a literary example, a novel, play, or poem that changed your view of medicine or a particular disease process? And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
I just wanted to say that Ahmad filled a gap in our program, and he spent a lot of time putting together this presentation. So despite the few technical difficulties that we had, I'm extremely appreciative of the work that was put into this. And it's unfortunate that we didn't have time to go into the discussion questions. But again, I just want to thank Ahmad for the work that he put into this and the deep dive that he did into the different literary works and the 3 examples that he used. So thank you so much.